I have to get myself off. That's it.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to leave that to you now, so you can take control and then share your screen, Michael.
Okay. Ok, buonasera a tutti.
Buonasera, Michael.
And just a minute, I think I need to move. Right, in this brief presentation, I intend to focus on a few of Raphael's works and artistic qualities, which, according to Vasari, turn Raphael into a mortal god. It is not my intention to go through every little detail, even though I might be inclined to do so, to be honest, but to mention some interesting insights which make Raphael's artistic works so interesting. So let's start. It is in Urbino that we have a chance to understand where and how it all began for Raphael. Born on Good Friday, 1483, Raphael was 8 years old when his mother and infant sister died in childbirth. After his father's subsequent death, Raphael was orphaned at 11 years old and placed in the care of his uncles. The medieval walled town of Urbino, built on top of two hills together with Pesaro in the Marca region, is the capital of the Pesaro-Urbino province. In Roman times, it was known as Urvinum Metaurense, and it became an important center during the Renaissance. It was Federico da Montefeltro, the third Duke of Urbino, who more than others contributed to the creation of the town as we know and see it today. Here we see a portrait of him by Piero della Francesca. He is portrayed sideways, for he had lost his right eye and his nasal bridge in a tournament. The Duke's dream was to transform Urbino into a modern capital where classical culture was flanked by a Christian one. Federico was a renowned intellectual humanist, on top of his impeccable reputation as a military man for martial skill and honor. He imposed justice and stability on his tiny state through the principles of his humanist education. In fact, Federico was nicknamed the Light of Italy for his contributions to enlightened culture. He engaged the best copyists and editions to produce the most comprehensive library outside of the Vatican and supported as well the development of fine artists. In fact, Piero della Francesca, who had also retired to the court of Federico, had created some of his most beautiful works, simplifying the figures until they became caressed, geometric solids from the light inserted in the space defined by perspective wings. During Federico's reign, Urbino reached its greatest period of artistic splendor, and the medieval residence of the Montefeltro was expanded and embellished to become the ducal palace. It became the physical symbol of the Renaissance, not a military castle taught to defend, although it was defended, but a building open to people and new ideas. Urbino and its surroundings give a dramatic landscape, which undoubtedly provided or were an inspiration to the young Raphael. There is something about Urbino that seems to encapsulate the characteristic aesthetic of the Italian Renaissance. Its undulating hills, its dramatic monuments, and its vast sky. So growing up surrounded by these picture-perfect views, it's no wonder that young Raphael found himself inspired to capture them and to populate them with his serene Madonnas and angels. The artist was born in this typical Renaissance, dignified bourgeois house on April 6, 1483. Sante di Peruzzolo, Raphael's grandfather, bought this house in 1464, where he opened a workshop wherein they manufactured and gilded the frames for the paintings. It was in this very same workshop that Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father, a painter of good quality, and also a poet appreciated at the court of Federico and Guidobaldo di Montefeltro, developed his proper activity, opening his workshop to contacts and clients of Montefeltro's court. On the left of the main entrance, one can note the workshop, the bottega of Giovanni Santi, now used as an art gallery. In this courtyard and paternal workshop joined to it, the young Raphael must have received his first painting lessons and, encouraged by his father, began to study Pietro della Francesca's works by practicing drawing and perspective, leading him to his first painting experiences. Within this environment, Raphael would have met, discussed, and learned from his father's assistants, and would have also come into contact with well-to-do clients and patrons of his father. In this very same courtyard, one can still see the stone table on which Giovanni Santi and his collaborators mixed the colors for their paints. One can also imagine the young Raphael watching his father and learning from his father how to grind and mix colors and prepare them for use. This Madonna with Child fresco is recognized as Raphael's first painting, his very first painting. And he will face the subject of the Madonna and Child several times, managing always to give different solutions for the ability to express the feelings that bind the two figures together. It is said that the many images of the Madonna and Child he painted are indeed luminous, revealing psychologically the sadness he felt at the loss of his own mother at a very young age. In the room where Raphael was born, one finds a fragment of this fresco representing the Madonna with Child. This fresco is found in the room where he was born, and it was once considered to be the work of Giovanni Santi, his father, who would have pictured his wife with young Raphael in her hands. However, recent studies have identified the hand of Raphael rather than that of his father Giovanni. The fresco represents the Virgin reading, with the child asleep on her knees, immersed in meditation, in silent depth of a niche. This work is to be considered one of Raphael's first tests for the rendering of the volume of the figures, in particular of the Virgin wrapped in the cloak, and the search for a relationship between the mother and the child, visible above all in the trusting abandonment of the latter. Also, typically Raphael's is the use of intense colors, the dark blue in the dress, in contrast with the soft tones of the complexions of the Virgin and the Child. We can split Raphael's artistic career into three phases. We will start with his early years. Briefly summarizing these years, Raphael received his first and early training under his father Giovanni in Urbino. Through his contacts with the court of Urbino, Giovanni also introduced his son to the humanistic philosophy at this court. Probably, the cultural activity of the city of Urbino helped to stimulate Raphael's exceptional output, who even before the age of 17 displayed a precocious talent. In 1500, at 17 years of age, Raphael gained recognition as a true master under his tutor, Perugino. His ability at this time was such that it was impossible to distinguish between the hand of Perugino or Raphael, both in style and technique. Raphael's earliest altarpieces were his first works, often painted for chapels, and they are remarkably close to the style of Perugino. The figures are posed lightly, as we shall see very soon. They are meek in gesture and sweet in expression. Many of the details derive from Perugino, whose own works at the time were indistinguishable from Raphael's, as we said. Raphael also imitated Perugino's technique of painting using an oil medium. So in 1500, at the age of 17, Raphael received his first commission, an altarpiece, dedicated to Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, who was a 13th century Augustinian hermit. And this was done for the chapel of Andrea Baronci in the church of San Agostino in Città di Castello, which is not too far away from Urbino. Although it was a joint commission, Raphael was recorded as the master of this piece of work. This altarpiece was damaged, however, unfortunately, in an earthquake in 1789, and only fragments of it remain. Pairs of angels once stood on either side of the main figure. The angel shown here was on the right and was not looking at the saint in the center, but at the figure on the edge of the picture. One can note the gracefulness of the angel and also his tender expression. Raphael's most important work at this early period in his life is the betrothal of the Virgin. Raphael worked on this painting, which we also know as Lo Sposalizio, while he was still an apprentice to Perugino. I like this painting in a particular way. In it, Raphael makes the transition from a highly skilled but devoted follower of Perugino in the local Umbrian manner and moves on to be an artist who represents the epitome of the Renaissance. This painting was executed immediately before Raphael's trip to Florence, where he experienced firsthand the sculpture of Donatello, from whom he learned quite a lot as well as the art of his most famous older contemporaries, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Most of the material used in this painting comes from the Gospel of Matthew and the 2nd century Proto-Evangelium of James. One passage in the letter, in the Proto-Evangelium, explains how Joseph and Mary came to be betrothed. Briefly, an angel tells the priest to call all the widowers to come to the temple with their rods. There will then be a sign to show which of the widowers should be betrothed to Mary. In the Golden Legend, Saint Joseph is chosen when a flower, a lily in this case, grows out of the rod, denoting the saint's attribute. The lily, a symbol of chastity, references the Catholic belief that Mary was a virgin throughout her earthly life. Moreover, and this is what I like most here, Raphael seems to add a humoristic tone to the tension between the contenders, when one of them, in frustration and disappointment, breaks his rod. Another point to note is Saint Joseph's age. This is because the 16th century saw in the portraiture of Saint Joseph a change. In fact, here we see Saint Joseph quite young, a young man. A common approach previously had been to follow the proto-evangelium of James in making him an old man, balding, graying, often leaning on a cane, to maintain belief in Mary's perpetual virginity. This kind of portrayal started to change at the turn of the 16th century, right at this time, as Joseph became more youthful on Molanus's, and Molanus was an influential counter-Reformation Catholic theologian at the University of Louvain. On Molanus's insistence to show a young man capable of restraining his urges, someone virile enough to take his wife and child on the difficult journey to Egypt, support them there with his labor, and then take them back to Israel. The polygonal temple in the style of Bramante in this painting establishes and dominates the structure of this composition, determining the arrangement of the foreground group and of the other figures. In keeping with the perspective recession shown in the pavement and in the angles of the portico, the figures diminish proportionately in size. The temple, in fact, is in the center of a radial system composed of the steps, portico, buttresses, and drum, and extended by the pavement. In the doorway, looking through the building and the arcade, framing the sky on either side, there is the suggestion that the radiating system continues on the other side, away from the spectator. And here we have a comparison. Where did Raphael get his idea of the temple? San Pietro in Montorio is a church in Rome, which includes in its courtyard the Tempietto, this famous Tempietto, which is a small commemorative martyrium, in other words, built by Donato Bramante, the famous Bramante. The Church of San Pietro in Montorio was built on the site of an earlier 9th century church dedicated to St. Peter on Rome's Janiculum Hill. It marks a traditional location of St. Peter's crucifixion. It is considered a masterpiece of high Renaissance architecture. Raphael's Lo Sposalizio was inspired, again, by Perugino's painting, Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter, which we can see on our right. And also, in my opinion, by Perugino's other painting, The Marriage of the Virgin, which can be seen on the left-hand side. The wide perspective of the picture, with at its center an octagonal edifice and a lined composition of the figures on the sides, is strongly related to this Perugino's Christ giving the keys to St. Peter, which is in the Sistine Chapel. Raphael, however, presents superior architectural renderings and more realistic foreground figures, as we saw in the previous slide. This slide helps us as well to understand how artists were influenced by each other's works, how these were modified and reproduced in their own works, according to their own inspiration. Arguably, the temple in the center of Perugino's Christ handing the keys to St. Peter is influenced by Brunelleschi's dome of the Duomo in Florence, which was completed in 1436. And therefore, Perugino, Raphael, Michelangelo were quite well aware of this building. We come to the middle and what I call the maturing years of Raphael. In 1504, Raphael moved to Siena, invited by another artist, Pinturicchio. Later, he then went to Florence, where he stayed for 4 years. Here, he actually met Leonardo and Michelangelo. It was during this time that Raphael painted a number of Madonnas. So this is where he started painting Madonnas, which embodied much of Leonardo's experimentation with realism and also with composition. In Florence, he also met Fra Bartolomeo, who persuaded him to abandon the graceful style of Perugino in favor of a more grandiose style. When it comes to Raphael's style and technique, his main artistic influences were, as I already mentioned and hinted to, Leonardo and Michelangelo. In particular, Leonardo's experimentation with realism, his use of gesture to create dialogue, and his innovative lighting techniques of chiaroscuro, so as to model faces with light from shadow, and also the use of the sfumato. Raphael also learned the Florentine method of building up a composition in depth with pyramidal figure masses. These figures are grouped as a single unit, yet each retaining their own individuality and shape. From Michelangelo, Raphael learned how to adapt full-bodied, lively figures with contrapposto pose. Over a short period of time, Raphael began to formulate his own style, which was quickly being acknowledged for its ease of composition, clarity of form, and also visual achievement. What distinguishes Raphael's work in Florence is the unity of composition of his works and this suppression of inessentials. Anything which has nothing to do is omitted. This painting, Madonna of the Meadow, it's also known Madonna of Belvedere or Madonna del Prato, was executed by Raphael when he was 23 years of age, only months within his arrival to Florence. It is the first of a series of full-length figure compositions that portray the apocryphal encounter between the child Jesus and the young John the Baptist. John is supposed to have recognized and worshipped Christ as the Redeemer, even in their childhood. Raphael makes this clear by letting Christ take the cross from John, handing it over to him. The scene represents the figures of the Virgin Mary, the infant Jesus, and the infant John the Baptist, shown in a calm, grassy meadow in a pyramidal arrangement linked by their gazes. Mary is wearing a gold-bordered blue mantle set against a red dress, extending her right leg along a diagonal. The blue symbolizes the church, and the red, Christ's crucifixion, Christ's sacrifice. Her eyes are fixed on Christ, her head turned to the left and slightly inclined, and her hands steady him as he leans forward unsteadily to touch the miniature cross held by John. The poppy, and it is here highlighted within a circle, the poppy refers to Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. The painting depicts a peaceful, tender, and even idyllic moment, disturbed only by Jesus' grabbing at the cross held by John the Baptist, which hints to the forthcoming passion of Jesus. This kind of serene and harmonious composition was held in very high regard and earned Raphael a commission to paint a fresco for the Pope at the Vatican Stanza in Rome. Michelangelo's influence on Raphael is also evident in this composition. The pyramidal structure of the figure group recalls Leonardo. But Raphael exerts his own balancing capacity, infusing it with the idyllic serenity which characterizes his paintings from this period. The work, as a whole, is structurally harmonic. From the figure group, dominated by the affectionate figure of the Virgin Mary, who supports the child and glances tenderly at the young John, to the sweeping landscape made luminous by the mirror-like lake, which stretches from one side of the panel to the other. The twisting figures of the two children clearly reflect Michelangelo's figurative research. The painting is characterized by a great depth of shadows and a subtle interplay of the cool and warm tones that model the flesh. After this, I'm moving on and just taking some important paintings from which we can understand more Raphael's artistic contribution. We come to the third phase, the advanced or the late period in Raphael's life, 1508-1520, when he actually died. On a recommendation by Bramante, the first architect to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Julius II invited Raphael to Rome. It would become his adopted home for the next 12 years. There he worked for both Pope Julius and his successor Leo X, the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. It was during this time that he gained the epithet Prince of Painters. During this period, Raphael's very large and complex compositions give a highly idealized depiction of the forms represented, though they are carefully composed to achieve sprezzatura, which means a composition done extremely well without showing that it took any effort. From the Madonna del Prato to the Stanze, and the theme of Raphael's Disputa del Sacramento, Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, or simply La Disputa, has perplexed scholars over the years, over its interpretation and over the identification of the personages which compose it. He was only 25 years old at the time when he painted this interesting, beautiful painting. The Disputa is an allegory for theology. It is located in the library room known as the Stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican Apostolic Palace, painted during the papacy of Julius II. On the opposite wall, exactly opposite this painting, is the School of Athens, an allegory for philosophy. And the two, in one way or another, are complementary. They try to explain each other. Giorgio Vasari, in his lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, first named the fresco Disputa del Sacramento, Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. Vasari thought the Disputa depicted a debate about the Holy Sacrament. But later scholars suggested the triumph of theology and the original history of the Church. Most likely, the figures around the altar are participating in Eucharistic adoration, not a dispute. Literary sources on the Eucharist recorded by the Apostolic Fathers confirm the Eucharist as the real presence of Christ and as the spiritual nucleus of Catholicism. The perspective from ground level, as we can see with the help of those red straight lines, takes the viewer to a vanishing point, the Eucharist. The writings of the Fathers also reflect the message of the validity of the Eucharist through apostolic succession, apostles to bishops and bishops down the ages. The abundance, perhaps I could go back a little bit. By celebrating the Eucharist in a visual framework of early Christian imagery, the Disputa emphasizes the authority of the Catholic Church in Rome through the apostolic succession that descended from St. Peter, the first bishop of Rome. It then passed from each successive bishop down to Pope Julius II, thus establishing the authority of the Catholic Church and the Papal States in Rome at a time when Rome was facing military threats from neighboring cities and countries. Though the wall that bears the Disputa is flat, it's a flat wall, stylistically it appears to curve as if it is an apse wall in a church. This design seems to have been intentional to recall early Christian church design. The Disputa displays certain early features as seen in the painting's motifs. One is the presence of Jesus as youthful and blonde, like Apollo, an ancient god associated with the sun and light. Apollo was a model for some of the earliest depictions of Jesus. In the Disputa, Jesus is portrayed with bare torso in heroic half nudity, recalls ancient statues of Apollo and Zeus. The abundance of otherworldly gold streaming down from a heavenly realm in the upper portion of the Disputa is a common feature in early Christian apse mosaics. In the Disputa, and we can see this in the yellow circle right at the top, the golden area, also known as the golden nimbus, is further defined by geometric vertical bands that radiate downward and outward, recalling the canopy of heaven motif known in early Christian, Byzantine, and even medieval apse mosaics. This realm represents the highest heaven and is frequently suspended above the physical heaven, sometimes portraying the hand of God emerging and pointing downward. In this case, we have God the Father with the orb in hand and his right hand projecting forwards as though blessing the world. In the Disputa, the early Christian formula of the semicircular, as we can see from the lines reflecting in apse, the semicircular group portrait shows Christ enthroned among saints, apostles, and men who are relevant to the development of Christianity, especially in reference to the Eucharist. So the whole topic of the Disputa focuses on the Eucharist. The early Christian motive of a mandorla, a circular or oval light that surrounds the entire body of a figure to show divinity, occurs in the Disputa. In the Disputa, Jesus is surrounded by a circular mandorla. Raphael chooses an early Christian motive to emphasize the divinity of Jesus and the heavenly light that he radiates. An early Christian motive of the traditio legis in Latin, the giving of the laws, is seen in Peter with a book, who sits at the far left in the divine realm. We can see Peter on the left-hand side, and we can see the traditio legis, the book in hand, refers to the passing of the laws from Jesus to Peter, establishing the legitimacy of the Catholic Church through the apostolic succession, and also in the traditium clavis, the giving of the keys, which can be seen in the hands of Peter at the left-hand side. The appearance of early Christian motives in the Disputa connect the Disputa with the early days of the founding of the Church in Rome. To fully understand the theology that is presented in the Disputa, one must be familiar with the writings of the early Church Fathers from the early Christian period, grouped around the altar in the painting, who contributed to the understanding of the Eucharist as the real presence of Christ through their writings. And here we have 4 doctors of the Church and 2 other saints. Positioned close to the altar, these include Saint Ignatius, Saint Irenaeus, and the 4 great doctors of the Latin Church identified by inscriptions in their halos and by books at their feet. Saint Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, with a halo inscription, is seated the 3rd figure to the right of the altar in the Disputa. Saint Gregory the Great, Doctor of the Church and Pope, is the 4th figure, seated to the left of the altar. Ignatius, who stands to the left of the altar in the Disputa, with both arms pointing toward the Eucharist. Saint Irenaeus, considered one of the greatest theologians of the 2nd century, is the 1st figure to the right of the altar, pointing upward to the heavenly realm. The 3rd figure to the left of the altar is the seated Saint Jerome, dressed in red and with a halo inscription. At his feet are the Bible and his letters. The 4th figure to the right of the altar is the seated Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, with his book, The City of God, at his feet. Now, these books were all part of the library of Pope Julius, because this was his study and his library as well. The Disputa, in the Disputa, the monstrance containing the Eucharistic wafer seen through its window occupies a position on the altar, a central position. Eucharistic adoration is the act of spirituality, adoring the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist that is visible in the monstrance. Through the monstrance on the altar is the vanishing point in the Disputa. The spectator's eye is drawn to Jesus Christ in the heavenly realm with stigmata, enthroned in glory in a golden mandala, with God the Father above and the Holy Spirit below, a reference to the Trinity. The presence of the Trinity is necessary for the prayer said during the Eucharistic prayer in the Roman canon, when the Church asks God the Father to send his Holy Spirit on the bread and wine so that by God's power they are turned into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, what we call transubstantiation. Thus, those who eat the sacred bread of the Eucharist become one body, one spirit in mystical union with Christ. So we can see that the viewer is led to the vanishing point, the Eucharist, and the Eucharist takes us upwards towards the Trinity, but it's the Trinity through the Holy Spirit which makes the host become the body and blood of Christ. The four Gospels, visible from the wings of the Spirit hovering above the monstrance, suggest the unbreakable relationship between the Eucharistic bread and the Word of God, and refer to the sacred tradition passed on by Jesus to his apostles so they may spread the good news. The proximity of the many angelic figures to Jesus suggests a Eucharistic connection. So they are not simply to adorn and fill the space. Their appearance in the heavenly realm may have a direct reference to the writings of Saint Augustine, who is seated amongst the humans, standing below in the earthly realm, who described the Eucharist as the bread of angels. And that is why we have the angels right at the top. In the upper tier of the heavenly realm, Jesus is flanked by his mother, the Virgin Mary, and by Saint John the Baptist. Mary is presented as the mother of the incarnate Jesus Christ, Jesus as the begotten Son of God, who is fully God and fully human. On both sides of them are figures from the Old and New Testament. To the left of Christ, we see Saint Peter with a book and keys. Adam next to him with legs crossed. Saint John the Evangelist in the act of writing. King David with a stringed instrument. Saint Stephen, one of the first martyrs of the church, and the prophet Jeremiah. On the right-hand side of Jesus are Judas Maccabeus in armor, Saint Lawrence with the gridiron under his right arm, Moses with the tablets of the Ten Commandments, Saint Matthew with a book, Abraham with a knife, and Saint Paul with his sword. Each person in the heavenly realm is relevant to history of the formation of the early church, associated with Jesus. Adam, Abraham, David, and Moses provide the Jewish lineage that will lead to the birth of Jesus. Jeremiah, the prophet, will predict the coming of Jesus. The presence of the patriarch Abraham records the promise of God to Abraham to make him a father of many nations. The apostles, Peter, John, and Matthew, members of the original 12 apostles, knew Jesus and were instrumental in the spreading of his teachings and early Christianity. Paul, who became an apostle after the ascension of Jesus, was one of the most important evangelists. These are the men who will pass down the teachings of Jesus and the early church to future generations through a steady line of apostolic succession. Peter, portrayed with a book and keys showing the motives of giving the laws, reaffirms the passing of the laws and spiritual authority from Jesus to Peter. Saint Stephen and Saint Lawrence in the heavenly realm are two of the earliest Christian martyrs. Among the many figures, and we will not mention all of them, done in this painting, and there are many which can be recognized, and many others which to this day can still be recognized, We can see Dante Alighieri was one of the first humanists and one of the originators of the early Renaissance. His Divine Comedy, a verse epic from 1320, was regarded as a theological work in Raphael's time, which is why in the Stanza della Segnatura, the poet is included among the famous men of the church. Concluding, in Raphael's Disputa, we see not only simply Eucharistic adoration, itself a purely religious act, but a dynamic school of thinkers gathered around the altar, intent on penetrating the meaning of the theological mystery. The link to the School of Athens, which happens to be just opposite this painting, is clear enough. These Christian doctors are just as animated in the search for truth as their pagan predecessors in the School of Athens facing them were. Towards this latter part of his life, I would like to just mention and focus as a concluding part on the tapestries of the Sistine Chapel. The tapestries do not fall within the categories of painting, sculpture, or architecture, but within the decorative arts. That is, areas of artistic production which have a more functional nature. Leo X commissioned Raphael to paint cartoons for the tapestries that were to hang on the lower part of the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael painted 10 intricate images that depicted the lives of Saints Peter and Paul, who were seen as the founders of the Christian Church and the sources of the Pope's authority and power. How much did they cost? Leo X paid Raphael 100 gold ducats, which is equivalent to 3,904 sterling pounds, for each cartoon. Whereas the tapestries themselves cost 1,500 ducats, which is the equivalent to 58,292 pounds each. Because of the rich materials and the labor-intensive process of the weaving, the choice of Raphael to design the tapestries was not coincidental, as his involvement undoubtedly added to the value of the object. Material value was enhanced by artistic prestige. Standing in front of this tapestry, we, the viewers, become the listeners, joining the circle of those people the apostle is addressing. Actually, Paul is in the foreground, the spiritual focus of the whole composition. He is preaching before the assembled Areopagus, the judicial council of Athens. His sermon was specifically addressed to the Gentiles, and the subject emphasizes his special role of preaching to them. The apostle of the Gentiles, he is known. The figure of Paul on the edge of the steps with his arms raised heavenward stands out above all those present, not only because of his higher position, but also because the rest of the onlookers have been rendered in a smaller scale, on a smaller scale. St. Paul's speech failed to convince the philosophers who could not accept the resurrection of the dead, but it did awaken a Christian vocation in some listeners who embraced the truth of the new doctrine. Among them were Dionysius, the Areopagite, and his wife Damaris, who are depicted climbing the steps on the right, encircled in red. The only figure facing away from Paul is the statue of Mars, or Ares, the god of war. Does he not want to listen to Paul? Has he declared war against Paul and his preaching? It's left to us to determine. In this scene, Raphael suggested also in creating a classical mood by integrating into the composition motifs from Roman reliefs and classical figures, buildings and statues. Once again, we can note that the composition is characterized by the circular temple, which is encircled in red, a copy, again, of Bramante's Tempietto. Concluding, Raphael's greatest talent lay in his ability to absorb stylistic and technical lessons from numerous great painters, making them his own. The rich coloring and grace of Perugino, the invented tonality of Leonardo, and the grand monumentality of Michelangelo. Added to this was his profound study of the antiquarian past while working under the papacies of Julius II and Leo X. It is no wonder that Giorgio Vasari felt inspired to write that possessors of such rare and numerous gifts as were seen in Raffaello da Urbino are not merely men, but mortal gods, truly divine. And here, the Vatican issued some commemorative coins commemorating the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death. But it's not just, and we can see on one side is the Madonna with child, and even the Republic of San Marino issued commemorative coins, and we can see as well here the figure of or part of the fresco of the Madonna with child on one side of the €2 coins. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much for your presentation, for the introduction to Divine Raphael. Grazie mille. I would like just to ask if any of you have got a question that would like to ask our speaker, Michael Cefai. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Okay, Michael, would you like to stop sharing the screen, if that's okay?
Yes, definitely.
And then we can always put it back if not. Okay.
Hi,
Thank you.
that was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. You mentioned that Raphael met Da Vinci and Michelangelo. What was his relationship like with those, particularly Vasari? Very much thought that Michelangelo was the most important painter of his lifetime.
For Vasari, definitely Michelangelo was the epitome of all art. The relationship of Raphael with Michelangelo was not a cozy one. In fact, Michelangelo wasn't happy with the work because he thought that he was using his work and getting all the praise. With Leonardo, perhaps it might have been a different relationship in this case. I think it was much more easier than Michelangelo, with Michelangelo, definitely.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, David, for your question. Thank you. If I've got another question from, you just want to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Thank you, Rob.
Yes, again, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. But what is it that the pre-Raphaelites objected to about Raphael's painting style?
I really don't know how to answer that, to be honest.
I'm sorry.
I think I can answer that.
Yes, if you can, I would appreciate that.
I'm a guide at Manchester Art Gallery, and we have a very good collection of pre-Raphaelites. What the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood objected to about Raphael was not so much Raphael, but the fact that after Raphael, everyone was copying him and painting in the same style. And the Pre-Raphaelites felt that British art was too much influenced by Italian art, and they wanted to go back to the time before Raphael, when they thought that things were more natural and more realistic. And the president of the Royal Academy was Joshua Reynolds, and he had actually studied in Italy, and he came back to Britain with all these ideas about Italian art. And the Royal Academy were very strict about how a painting should be done, what the composition was, following what Raphael had set out to do. So the Pre-Raphaelites, in a way, it was a little bit like Brexit. They wanted to go back to art before Raphael, and they also wanted to see English literature, English history shown in the paintings, and also contemporary issues. For example, poverty, the fallen woman, that was a very common theme. And they were really groundbreaking for the time, because they rejected the way that British art was being modelled on what Raphael and his followers had done. So that's a little bit from my point of view. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, it was a very full answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Very nice to have that. Okay, thank you. I think we're almost finished. Is anybody else who would like to ask another question to Michael? Okay, I think it seems.
Could I ask one?
Of course,
certainly you may.
Joseph, you've been waiting. Please go ahead.
This isn't a particularly deep question, but what was it about Raphael that enabled him to sort of crack out the paintings at such a rate? Because if I remember rightly, did he produce nearly 200 during his lifetime?
He did, yeah.
Which pretty impressive. So
it is impressive, and I think that is what impressed, for example, Vasari, definitely. I think it's not a question of just the environment, but also the innate talent which you have and which you can develop with the help of others. He was a quick learner. He absorbed very quickly what Leonardo did, what Michelangelo did. But obviously, he also made them his own and came out with his own interpretation using the techniques and the skills which these other artists actually used. In fact, that is why Michelangelo many times was very angry at him, because he said he was plagiarizing his work. In reality, he wasn't. He was taking the technique, the idea, even from Leonardo, the pyramidal structure, but obviously giving his own interpretation, creating his own way. Interesting, what is amazing is that what for others might have taken many years, for Leonardo, it took just a few years, because he was so much imbued with it, so much full of it from an early age. I'm not saying that the others weren't at an early age also capable, but not everybody develops at the same time. Not everybody has the same talent. Some are born with it and develop it. Some are not born with it completely and need to work harder to develop it. And that is why perhaps Vasari ends up by saying he's a mortal god, because he's full of it more than others.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for the questions as well. Okay, I think we're going to finish now the evening. I would like to give a very, very big thank you to Michael for your very interesting talk tonight. So a big clap, even if you're on mute. Thank you, grazie. I would like to thank all of you to join us this evening. We really hope you enjoyed, and of course we look forward to see you at our next event. Because of circumstances, we will send you the link via mail a few days before. Feel free to join us. If you've got any question, any suggestion, very welcome. And we look forward to see you at our next event. Next event from us in Loughborough is on next Friday. We're going to talk about Italian cinema with Professor Gianluca Fantoni from the University of Nottingham, the Trent University of Nottingham. You're all welcome, and of course we'll let you know also the other event from the other Dante Alighieri Society in the United Kingdom. Ok, so that's buonasera from us.
Buonasera.
Buonasera.
Everyone, take care, keep safe.
Grazie mille.
Bye.
Thank you, Gianluca.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Thank
much.
you, Michael. Thank you,
Hello,
Gianluca.
Caroline.
Stay safe.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was very, very
You're welcome, Gianluca.
yes. Thanks for you. Of course, we'll see you soon. We catch up soon, and also
Yes, we will.
on the next talk in the spring. But
You're right.
yeah.
Cheers. Good night.
Sì.
Cheers.
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte.